It's here. It's finally here. Chainsaw Man is here, baby. If you'll let me reminisce just for a second, it feels like I have heard about this series since the beginning of time. Since anime and manga ever existed, there was always Chainsaw Man at its core, and it's one of those things that I always had an interest in. More and more my friends would get into it, and more I would feel like I was missing out. And it's one of those things where I just held off looking into it as long as I possibly could because I knew this day would come. I knew that the anime was only a matter of time, and finally, we are here. Hello everybody, I am Phenom Sage, and welcome to a brand new review series on the anime known as Chainsaw Man. Today we are going to be taking a look at episode 1, the premiere, Dog and Chainsaw. And before we get into the review itself, I just want to make it clear right from the get-go that despite this being maybe the most popular and anticipated new anime series maybe ever, I'm actually almost completely blind on this entire series, and that alone already makes me really excited to jump into it and see what the whole series is all about. If you want to know what I did know about this series ahead of time, it essentially just boils down to, I know the astronaut panel, I know the He's Just Like Me meme, I knew Denji, Makima, Power, I know there's another guy with them, I know there's a girl with an eye patch, I know all of those characters visually, I don't actually know their characters, and I knew ultimately that he turns into a Chainsaw Man. This is in fact not a series about a carpenter learning to woodwork. So that more or less sums up everything that I knew about this series going in, and I'm asking you guys to keep it chill, keep it anime only in the comments, just so I can stay blind on this series all the way to the end. And not knowing anything about this series, I think should wind up giving me some interesting perspectives and opinions on a lot of the stuff in this series, because I know for a fact that a good portion of the people watching this have these preconceived expectations about how certain things should be handled in relation to the manga, or how they should be adapted. And I think in the end, those feelings aren't wrong. I think it's totally fine to have those expectations for something you've already read, but I also think that they can warp your feelings on something as a standalone experience. Within this first episode alone, I've already heard some very interesting things, which we will get into, but it's just something good to keep in mind as far as what your opinions on this series actually turn out to be. And speaking of opinions, I suppose I should actually say what I thought about this episode, and naturally, I thought it was great, man. This is pretty much exactly what I was hoping for as far as an introduction into this series. It doesn't overwhelm you, it doesn't rush past anything, it doesn't make any missteps as far as building this world and this character. And overall, I'm just a big fan of how this episode is executed on. And in terms of world building, actually, now that I bring that up, I'm actually surprised at how restrained this episode was bringing the audience into the world, because that's actually a very common thing, especially in shonen, to just info dump everything about your world and how it operates as soon as you possibly can, because you just want to get that out of the way and start operating on those rules. But in Chainsaw Man, I feel like I can sum up everything we learned about this world on 3 fingers. I know there's devils, I know there's people who hunt these devils, and I know that there are people who can turn into devils, and I really think that's all you need in this episode, because at the end of the day, it is all about Denji's character, Denji's situation in life, and grounding you into his reality before it goes full supernatural shonen at the end. And I think that that grounded reality is what makes a lot of the stuff earlier in the episode hit as hard as it does. And that's kind of where I want to steer this review, because like I mentioned before, I was not sure what this series was going to be like tonally. I did get kind of an impression from the trailers and the PVs, but at the same time, my impression from those trailers seemed to conflict with what I've heard people say that this series isn't. This isn't just an edgy, dour, somber fest of miserable characters. I heard many people say that beforehand, and I believe them. And yet this first episode certainly doesn't deny that very strongly. This is a very dour and very depressing first episode, watching how terrible Denji's life is and how much he really doesn't deserve that life. And I think that's fine. I think that's a perfectly reasonable way to bring you into this story and make you understand his character. Hell, I was getting misty-eyed in some scenes just because of how well they portray his suffering without hitting you over the head and making it really melodramatic. It's not melodramatic at all. It's just cold. It's just really, really goddamn cold. So I was a fan of that aspect of the tone, and yet in spite of that, I have heard complaints about the tone and how this series is actually much funnier than this episode really lets on. And I don't know if that has to do with this episode specifically, or if they're talking about the series as a whole, because I definitely didn't laugh in this episode. I didn't really find much humor in what was going on. I guess there were some dark, ironically humorous things in the episode, like Denji selling his left testicle, but overall just not something that I personally felt here. And yet, if you watch the opening, it is pretty clear that the series should hopefully become more fun and more expressive and more jubilant. But for now, I really do think people should just wait and see how the tone evolves once Denji and the rest of the characters are all assembled, because I think that is when the humor and the dynamics will be at their most entertaining. And one impression I've gotten about the series from hearing people talk about it is that the humor meshing with the darker and more dramatic stuff is a big part of the identity to Chainsaw Man. It is that mesh of those tones that makes this series what it is. So hopefully they don't mess it up, and hopefully we can see more of that as the series continues. Outside of the tone though, one thing that I really loved about this episode in terms of narrative were these really strong thematic through lines that connected everything in this episode together in a really nice way, and it ended up leading to some really good payoffs by the end. Denji's core struggle in this episode is this desire for a normal life, or more specifically, a better life. And for one, his situation in this episode, the fact that he does really just want to live normally without all of this horrible burden being placed on him, these horrible living conditions that he had no control over, all of this stuff just ends up making him so much more sympathetic and endearing. I want to root for this guy. But beyond that aspect of his character, this idea of living a normal life actually has some pretty interesting implications to it as far as the future for his character. By the end of the episode, Makima appears before Denji in this room filled with massacred devils, and he is just completely gone. He doesn't even have the strength to get out of there. And when he makes this deal with Makima, this agreement to work under her in exchange for a place to stay and food to eat, he asks her what is for breakfast, what will they eat? And when she tells him that it will probably be bread with jam and butter, coffee, and salad, these completely normal things, it's not like this is a feast or an extravagant lifestyle, but to Denji, it's literally everything that he's sought after while growing up, and it just makes that final scene, and it makes Makima hit a lot harder because of how they set that up beforehand. On the topic of that setup though, on the topic of these thematic through lines that connect everything together that happens in this episode, there's another side to this whole idea of Denji wanting a normal life. Because for Denji, his bar is very low. He's suffered pretty much his entire life, and all he wants at the end of the day is something better than he already has. And the episode goes out of its way to portray the Yakuza guys in the exact same way. The Yakuza members here had a much better life than Denji, and yet when it came to it, they still wanted more. The series is essentially saying that everybody wants a life better than they have. Nobody wants to be stagnant, and everybody has something that they desire. And what I wonder in relation to this idea is how it will affect Denji's life going forward. Because by the end of the episode, you can assume that Denji's life has suddenly gotten a lot better. He's going to have a much better living situation. He's going to actually be able to eat food. He's going to meet new people and make new friends. All of these things that he's wanted this entire time. So my question is, if you give Denji all of these things that he's wanted, where does the series take him from there? Will he be satisfied with his life at that point, or will he continue to want something better and better? Because on one hand, one thing they do make explicitly clear throughout the episode is that Denji is very obedient. He's very loyal. He spent years doing this horrible work in the worst conditions, and yet he didn't even show the slightest resentment towards these guys until the very end. And you would assume that that kind of obedience and loyalty will naturally transfer over to Makima as well. And yet part of me wants to say that if this series continues these themes of ambition and drive that is letting Denji continue to dream more and more, eventually he's going to reach a point where he wants even greater things. He might eventually want to break captivity and servitude to Makima, and stuff like that just makes me really excited to see where they end up taking the story and the characters. One of the people in my Discord server, discord.gg phenomsage, actually said that they were kind of disappointed by the end of the episode because Denji didn't really end up overcoming this concept of being a dog. He didn't really accomplish much of anything in the grand scheme of things. If anything, he's still just a dog who ended up switching owners. And I agree with that, but instead of being disappointed, it actually just makes me really anticipate the future of this story. Because now, thematically, there's kind of an end goal for this character, this idea and this dream of escaping captivity and living the way that he wants to. While we're on Makima though, I really want to talk about Makima a bit more because she definitely didn't get a lot of screen time. In fact, I don't think we even got her name this episode, so I'm sorry if I spoiled that for anybody. But within the very brief amount of time that we do get with her, I feel like there's already a few things that you can say. For one, her presence is just immediately felt in such a strong way. This is easily the character that I was the most interested in finally seeing what her deal is. Who is this character? And the two things that I really walk away from appreciating right now are, one, her screen presence, just the way the scene completely changes as soon as she enters the picture and starts speaking, something that I assume will persist throughout the series, and two, how straightforward, calm, and unfazed she is at the things that are happening and the things that she is saying. I love that the very first interaction that she has with Denji, with this devil, she enters into a room filled with dead bodies, sees this devil in front of her, and when it asks for a hug, she hugs Denji with no hesitation. That alone already kind of says a lot about who she is as a character and how this relationship will end up operating, but the conversation that follows, the fact that she tells him that he can either die like a devil or work under her, I think she literally says that she will keep him as a human. It just blatantly comes across like this woman is going to be very controlling and very manipulative, and I love how quickly you can get a read on her character in a matter of moments. That's just really not an easy thing to do in terms of writing and plotting, and I think it's handled here very well. The last big thing that I wanted to bring up about this episode, though, is obviously the production. Now, this is clearly a beautiful looking series in my opinion. I don't think anyone can deny that aspects of the art, the direction, the backgrounds, the meticulously crafted animation, clearly a lot of talent and passion has gone into this series. And I'd like to, over the course of this review series, maybe try to highlight some of the individual people who are really bringing certain aspects to life. One such person in my head right now is a man named Kiyotaka Oshiyama, a hugely talented and influential person in the anime industry, and on this series, he is the person entirely responsible for adapting the demon designs to anime, and maybe even doing some original demon designs, I don't know. We'll have to see, but just people like that are all over this series in really cool places, making these episodes and the artistic qualities of this series as good as they are. However, in spite of all that, in spite of that immense talent that's behind this series, I actually have heard quite a few complaints about the visuals in this series as well, and it primarily comes down to two different things. For one, this series does in fact have CGI prominently used for the chainsaw sequences. We knew that was going to be the case ever since the PVs, and everybody was wondering how it was going to ultimately turn out. I honestly think it looks fine. It didn't really take me out of the episode too much as far as the action and spectacle goes, but it definitely does feel weaker compared to the more carefully crafted animation, so I do understand to an extent having an issue with that, but to me that's the way less interesting one to talk about as far as complaints go. There's always going to be people complaining about CG, no matter how good that CG actually looks. The more interesting complaint to me, though, is about the overall aesthetic and color tone of the series. Like I mentioned before, this is a very muted, dreary looking series aesthetically, and in this episode in particular, I think that does really work and does lend itself to the atmosphere and to Denji's situation. But when you look at the scope of this series, when you look at it as a whole, I do know that a lot of source readers for the story were hoping the series would be a lot more colorful. I haven't seen much, but from the manga pages that I have seen, and even if you just look at the volume covers, this does appear to be a very loud, very over-the-top and expressive aesthetic that I could understand feeling honestly kind of disoriented seeing it portrayed in this episode so differently. Now for me, somebody who just has no experience with that, I am perfectly fine with this series doing its own thing and capturing its own style, but at the same time I do wonder and kind of hope that the series ends up embracing that more stylized aesthetic, at least in key moments, later down the line. If I had any real complaints with this episode though, like just things that took me out of the experience and brought down the storytelling a bit, I would say it mostly comes down to some of the dialogue. Now, this is the early days, this is the literal beginning of the story, and I fully embrace positioning this story around this one character for his introduction, but at the same time, because Denji doesn't really have anybody to play off of in this episode, it leads to a lot of the exposition about his character and the dialogue that fills us in on his situation and what he's doing, what his past was like, all of these different things. You kind of just have to learn through Denji awkwardly talking to himself. And that in itself isn't an issue to me. I actually like that as a bit of characterization, how Denji is this character in a place in his life where he's basically just talking to himself and Pochita like a madman. But at the same time, a lot of his ramblings actually don't end up feeling like ramblings. They feel very scripted and very info-dumpy as far as figuring out how to deliver this information to the audience. So I think that aspect definitely could have been handled more organically, but at the same time, I'm pretty sure that it will only end up being an issue in this first episode, because I assume in the next episode, the group dynamics and Denji's relationship with other characters will be much, much more prominent in the story and the writing. Overall, though, a great episode, man. A really great episode. I'm not going to say anything crazy like it lived up to the hype, but it's just a great first episode and hopefully the beginning of a great series. Let me know what you guys thought about this Chainsaw Man Episode 1 premiere, either in the comments or talk to me in the Discord community linked below. Did you love it? Did you hate it? Were you disappointed? Were you satisfied? I want to hear everything. Just make sure, again, to keep it spoiler free, keep it anime only, just so everyone is on the same playing field here and can enjoy this story with no issues. Thank you all so much for watching. I love you, and I will see you in the next video.